Welcome to Commander Central, episode 312, and today we'll be taking a look at listener Austin Yorko's Rankle Master of Pranks deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going today?
Pretty good, Dana. How about yourself?
I am doing all right. We were hoping Chris would be back this week, but maybe next week. He's still kind of recovering from his recent surgery.
Yeah.
But he's doing pretty well as far as we can tell. So, Max, let's get into talking about Magic real quick. Did you play any games in the last week or so?
I have not.
The one interesting, I didn't get to go to the shop this week. I actually got a couple singles from them, but I didn't go to pick them up because I had a work thing and I was just up late and I just went to bed last night rather than go to the shop. So like 9 o'clock, literally. So I had a few things to take care of and didn't go in. I did, however, want to mention a couple things. Got to play on Brouhaha Suicide's stream on last Friday night. It would have been to raise money for a charity for Ukraine, so that was a lot of fun. Got to play a couple good games, and then the previous week I got to play on the Commander Rules Committee stream. And the one thing I will mention about that is, so we did our first pregame power level chat, and I was playing my Kresh deck and explain what it did, and it's not going to win probably before turn 10 or so. This is the power level, whatever. And I think it was Gavin's like, that's a perfect pregame chat. You didn't worry about numbers. You just explain what the deck did, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we start the game and it didn't ramp crazy quick because there isn't that much ramp in the deck, but I just hit every piece. And then partial board wipe came out and it turned Kresh into like a 30-30 by like turn 7. And what am I going to do? Not attack?
Right.
So I just killed everybody. I'm swinging at Sheldon first, I guess, I actually said it out loud. I'm like, well, Sheldon doesn't have, nobody had blockers too, because the partial board wipe took a bunch of them out. I'm like, well, Sheldon has mana free, so if someone's got an answer, he has it. That's why I'm swinging at Sheldon. And it's like, nope, you killed me. And then I'm like, okay, and goes around back to next turn, and I killed whoever it was I killed next. And then actually, I wound up not winning the game anyway. Then somebody killed Kresh, and I died to like a zombie horde or something. I don't remember if it was Scott Larrabee or who it was, but then it just felt like a jerk, because like this deck's not going to kick off, and I'm not going to win before turn 10, and I take out 2 people on like turn like 7 and 8.
Proud of you, Dana.
Yeah, with the rules committee aside on top of that. So yeah, is what it is. I mean, they understood because it was clearly just kind of a fluke. If it wouldn't have been Kresh, and it wouldn't have been a partial board wipe, and it wouldn't have been whatever, it was obviously a bunch of things that all came together to allow it to happen. But of all the places, of all the people, yeah. So remember, any deck can technically kick off at any point in time, I guess.
Yep.
So yeah, that's really it. I haven't built anything new. There was a lot of cards from Neon Dynasty I wanted to put in decks, but I usually wait on new commanders until I can see how often they get played. I just don't like building something that has a bunch of other decks, so I'm holding off on that. And we're already closing in on New Capenna time, so.
Ugh. Yeah,
welcome, my friends, to the show that never ends. But hey, if you out there in listener land want to reach out to us and then talk about some cool games you played, how'd you go about doing that, Max?
You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central. And you can find us over on patreon.com/CMDR Central, where you can check out our reward tiers, such as a Dex You Play show or joining our community to chat and play virtual EDH with us.
Yeah, we appreciate any way you can support the show. Patreon means a lot, but if all you can do is click that like button and upvote on whatever your podcast app of choice is, we appreciate that as well. It all means a lot. So since we're talking about Patreon, Max, should we just jump into this deck tech from Austin Yorko?
Let's do it.
So, Rankle, Master of Pranks, and for those that don't recall Rankle, Rankle's a fairy rogue for 2 black. He's a 3/3 with flying and haste. Whenever Rankle, Master of Pranks, deals combat damage to a player, you choose any number of the following. Each player discards a card, each player loses a life and draws a card, and each player sacrifices a creature. And you can technically choose all 3 of those modes. So the first question we asked Austin is what your meta is like. Austin says, I mostly play with the same group of about 10 friends. We have a healthy mix of people who've been playing for a decade and people who have only been playing a year or 2. While a bunch of us like to break out the occasional funny theme deck, we mostly play pretty optimized lists. Definitely not CEDH level, but very interactive games that end in a massive play that takes out multiple players at once, whether it's by a combo or an overwhelming quickly built board state. Most games last 8 to 10 turns, with some running 12 plus turns, but only because we all play quite a bit of interaction. And we ask what the goal of the deck is, and Austin says he came back to Magic after a little break and fell in love with Rankle because he embodies a symmetrical way to do everything the black portion of the color pile likes to do. This deck is designed to use combat damage to trigger control of the board and dig down into the deck, and the main win con is to discard powerful creatures with his ability and reanimate them late in the game.
We follow that up with what are the weaknesses or areas that we should focus on when looking at the deck. Austin said, the deck plays well, but there are two things that I haven't been able to overcome. The first is it has started to feel stale. He likes Rankle because he thinks it embodies the color black. However, I've been looking to switch cards out that quite honestly bore me, such as Exsanguinate and Grey Merchant of Asphodel. He'd like to find some cool win cons using abilities that feel a little fresher. Another weakness is he has a hard time closing out the game. This deck is really good at controlling the board, but none of the win cons are lasting or explosive enough to secure a win if somebody gets out from under me in terms of a board presence or card advantage. I usually drain a player or two, or maybe knock someone with a big flying demon only to get overrun. I think I made the deck a bit too much let's get value and dirtle with control and let's move towards a win at all times. And another note he says is he's thinking about taking out a couple of the tutors in the deck, which would make 3 spots for any recommendations we have. For budget regards, there are no budgets for this deck. This used to be a chainer deck, so he has a lot of the cards probably that we may or may not recommend.
Okay. All right, Max. So let's jump into taking a look at this Rankle Master of Prankle's deck. What's the land base look like here?
There are 33 lands, 35 counting a couple MDFCs in other sections of the deck. So the 33 lands are Ancient Tomb, Arcane Lighthouse, Barren Moor, Bojuka Bog, Cabal Coffers, Castle Lochwain, Cavern of Souls, Gyre Reach Sanitarium, High Market, Phyrexian Tower, Shizo's Death Storehouse, and 21 Swamps and an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth.
Okay, so anything you particularly like here before we go into things you dislike?
What I like is the Shizo's Death Storehouse. This is one of those legendary lands from the original Kamigawa block.
Yep.
It comes in untapped, you make black mana, and you can pay a black and tap it to give target legendary creature fear until end of turn. And what I like about this is actually kind of a political card where you can help your opponents out. So maybe if you aren't closing out a game, you can convince someone else to swing at, opponent number 2 with their giant commander or legendary creature, and you could say, hey, I'll help get the damage through.
So the kind of the push-pull with mono-black decks, or really any monocolored deck in terms of the land base, is you usually can afford to run a ton of utility lands, or at least a ton of lands. I mean, this is a utility land, I guess, but it doesn't come into play tapped, and it makes black mana, so the difference between it and a swamp is pretty minimal. You can afford to run a bunch of those kind of lands in a monocolored deck because you only need to make one color, right? So 2/3 of your pips are going to be colorless. They'll let you use colorless lands. In this case, it still makes you a black anyway, so it's even less of an impact, but you can afford to run a ton of stuff. However, in a monocolored deck as well, there are things that really take advantage of you running a bunch of swamps or a bunch of mountains or a bunch of whatever, whether it's something like Valakut or Cabal Coffers that give you a bonus for having those things, or mana doublers, Mana Reflection or Vernal Bloom and Green, or the artifact ones like the Gauntlets or like Cage Sun or whatever. This is a deck that isn't leaning into the doublers. There's a Cabal Coffers here and a Crypt Ghast, but it's not one of those decks like my mono black deck, for example, has the Cage Sun, it has the Gauntlet of Power, it has the Extraplanar Lens, it is running the Crypt Ghast, it has the Nirkana Revenant. So my mono black deck really does care very much about the ability to double my lands from prickly swamps. This deck is not one that for the most part cares, so you can afford to devote those things over to things like Shizo's and quite a few different utility lands that are in here. So that's not really here or there about this particular deck, but I wanted to point it out because it is something to consider when you do build basically any kind of monocolor deck. Do you want to lean into the doubling? And if you do, you probably want to keep the utility lands pretty lean. But if you're not, you've got a lot of room to run utilities in a deck. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it's kind of a deck building thing to know regarding any kind of monocolor deck. And yes, I do like Shizo as well. There's just no downside to it, and it lets you poke through, particularly, if in this case, your commander wants to be able to punch through and deal combat damage to a person. It does have evasion. Being able to give it fear just makes it's that much more likely to poke through and deal that damage. I do like Arcane Lighthouse in general. The problem with Arcane Lighthouse for me is I only have so many slots, and in most of my decks for utility lands, and it never quite makes the cut. But I feel like in this deck, number one, there's a lot of targeted removal, and because you have the slots, I like seeing someone running Arcane Lighthouse. There's just a lot of situations where being able to get past those Lightning Greaves or the hexproof on something makes a big difference. So I do like people haven't forgotten about that card. It's very, very useful and makes sense here when you've got the room to run it.
Totally. What don't you like about this land base, Dana?
I know you have this in the notes that you put here, Max, but I'm going to start off by saying it too. I don't love Baron Moor. I don't love the cycling lands in general unless you have some added utility where you can abuse the fact that they have cycling. I think maybe in mono white or something, you're like, if I have somehow 2 lands in hand, I only need 1, I want to turn it into something else because you're desperate for draw. I just don't feel like you are ever that desperate in black. I would much rather just have a land that's always useful than have a land that I feel like is basically a bad swamp that will occasionally get discarded. I feel like you just need something extra to justify the ETB tapped portion of it, and I don't think this deck really does. So I don't love Baron Moor or any of the lands that have cycling that come into play tapped, particularly in a mono black deck.
Yeah, you said everything I would say. Black just has enough draw. I don't think you need a cycling land in this deck.
There's also a Gaia Reach Sanitarium in here. For those who don't recall, it's a legendary land that taps for a colorless, and you can spend 2 on each player, draws a card, then discards a card. So I get the thinking here because there is, a good bit of reanimation in this deck. We'll talk about when we get to that point. I still tend to not think that's worthwhile. Number one, in order to make that work, you have to both have a big creature in hand that you want to discard because you don't have a better reanimation target, and you have to have a way to reanimate it. If you don't have both of those things, all you're doing is letting 3 people draw cards and you're drawing 1, and then also discarding, so you're not getting cards ahead, so you're spending mana, you're giving everyone else card selection, and all you're getting is card selection, and you're maybe fueling someone else's reanimation deck, or graveyard deck, or whatever. There are times it's definitely great, and there's situations in certain decks where it's great. I think the amount of times you don't have everything lined up in this deck probably outweighs the amount of times you do, whereas War Room just draws you a card and costs you 1 life every time you use it in this deck. If you want a land that draws you a card, I would just run War Room. I think I get why Gaia Reach Sanitarium's here. I just don't feel like the variables line up often enough to offset the downsides.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And outside of War Room, you could also run something like Bonder's Enclave that cares about a creature having power 4 or greater, or even Roadside Reliquary, where you have to sacrifice it, but you'll draw a card if you control an artifact, and you'll draw an additional card if you control an enchantment. So,
and this deck has 12 artifacts and 9 enchantments, so you're probably, particularly later on in the game, when you might want to get rid of it, or you might want to utilize it, you're probably going to have 1 of each out. Yep. It's actually probably a better version of the Baron Moor.
Yeah,
it never comes into play tapped, and like once you play Baron, if you have Baron Moor in your open hand, you got to play it. That's it. If you have Roadside Reliquary in your opening hand and you play it, well, then you just can use it on turn 9 and still get the gas out of it. So yeah, I like Reliquary there, and I would probably run that in that Baron Moor slot. And I think awesome. You had one more recommendation for a land here you'd add, Max.
Oh yeah, this is a monocolored deck. I would try to find a spot for Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx.
Mm-hmm.
Just looking at all the creatures in the deck, they all have, majority of them have 2 or more pips. Your enchantments have 1 to 2 pips on all of them. So I just think you're always going to be able to net more than 4 mana with Nykthos out on the field.
Yeah, I mean, your commander alone gets you halfway there in the command zone. So your commander and probably 1 other permanent, you're probably getting already 1 mana ahead of Nykthos, let alone if you have 2 or 3 things out, you're probably, doubling it. I agree. It's not a cheap card these days. It's, closer to $30, I think. But like, if you have 1, or you're looking, if this is the kind of deck we want to keep around forever, and you're like, I'm going to, spend $20 a month and add new cards to it that require me to save up, I would look at a Nykthos. Agreed. That's a really good card in this deck. Okay, let's jump over and take a look at the artifact base here. There's an Arcane Signet, Mana Rock. There's an Everflowing Chalice, same thing. Expedition Map lets you go get that Cabal Coffers or that Nykthos should you add it, or whatever other useful utility land this deck might have. Felwar Stone, Geth's Grimoire. I'll read that quick. 4 mana. Whenever an opponent discards a card from his or her hand, you may draw a card. That's great in this deck. Jet Medallion. Black spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so, almost 2/3 of the card in this deck are going to be affected by that. A Mask of Grizzlebrand, Mimic Vat, Mind Stone, Soul Ring, Star Compass, which is a mana rock that ETB's tapped, and it makes 1 mana of any color that a basic land you control could produce. And Wayfarer's Bauble, which is a way to go ramp up a land. So, first things first, I mentioned Geth's Grimoire. With a commander that discards, that's cards bonkers in this deck. That's a perfect include. I just wanted to point that out. For ones I don't necessarily love here, I don't like Star Compass.
What are you talking about, Dana? It's a,
well,
it's a star and a compass.
Yeah, I guess.
It's 2 things.
Again, this is a deck that just doesn't need to worry that much about colored mana. You only need black, so you don't need fixing. As long as you have the pips, you can get there. Your mana rocks producing colorless are going to be fine 99% of the time. It does come into play tapped, is the downside to it. But the other downside is, again, there's more than a few utility lands in this deck, and you are going to find yourself in a situation where, you keep a hand with, Urborg and Phyrexian Tower or something, and drop Star Compass on turn 2, and on turn 3 it doesn't tap for anything, so you don't have any basic lands out. That's not going to happen that often, but it's going to occasionally happen. Whereas I feel like something like Liquid Metal Torque, yes, it only makes colorless, but it always comes into play untapped, and it's always going to produce you mana.
Yep.
Let alone you're going to find yourself in those situations where somebody has, the mono red players got cast a Vandal Blast, and you can just use it to turn someone else's commander into a creature. Or you make a deal with somebody. Hey, we need to deal with this thing. Does anybody have an answer to it? And they're like, nope, I have no enchantment removal. And they're like, well, I can turn it to an artifact. Do you have artifact removal? Yeah, I do. That happens too, more than you would think. So I feel like the loss of utility going down from Star Compass making black mana to Liquid Metal Torque making colorless is way offset by the utility of Liquid Metal Torque and the fact that it comes into play untapped every time.
Yeah, I don't like Star Compass either. I would probably say go up 1 more mana in CMC value. Put a Commander Sphere in here, because at least it'll always tap for black, and you can sacrifice it after tapping it to draw a card.
Yeah, for sure. Because this deck is pretty, for the most part, relatively efficient. There's some big beater creatures, but outside of that, it's pretty efficient. You could get away with a 3 mana rock if you wanted to, very easily.
What I did notice, and I noticed it here in the artifact section, we're going to notice it, I think, throughout the rest of the deck, is I think Austin is trying to play to each ability of Rankle.
Yes. Yeah.
Here we saw Geth's Grimoire that deals with the discarding outlet. There's also a Mimic Vat in here, which would probably play into the sacrifice ability of Rankle. And so I'll probably say this again at the end of the show, but I think what would help this deck with the whole winning the game problem is focus on one of those abilities and make that kind of your primary focus. And then, if you want to do the sacrifice stuff, make that the focus. And then, play a few extra things for maybe the discard part. But I feel like every section of this deck has cards that want to do either discard or benefit from people sacrificing their creatures or stuff dying. So I think there's a little bit of a focus issue here as well.
The only thing I would say, I tend to agree. The only thing I would say is, luckily enough, the cards he's running, like Mimic Vat, for example, is just good. Even if you're not forcing sacrifice, you're probably going to get pretty good value out of it. So if you are going to keep things spread with multiple focuses, at the very least, try to use cards that are good generically in any situation. And at least Mimic Vat has that going for it.
Mm-hmm.
A couple possible suggestions I would throw out there. Stronic Resonator. Anytime a commander has a triggered ability like Rankle is pretty decent. But what's nice about it in this case is because you can choose any of those Rankle abilities, they're all tied to one trigger. So they're all tied to Rankle dealing combat damage. So if you copy that triggered ability with a Stronic Resonator, you're copying whatever the ability to choose all of those things. So for 2 mana on a combat damage thing from Rankle, each player discards 2 cards. Each player loses 2 life and draws 2 cards. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. Being able to double up that ability in any combination thereof, too. So, you can choose that as, you can ignore the card draw and just make everyone discard 2 cards. You could ignore, 2 of the abilities and make everyone sacrifice 2 creatures. You can layer that in any combination of ways you want to do it. And I think that is very, very interesting because that gives you a lot of utility and a lot of ways to sculpt Rankle's ability, that triggered ability, based on what's best for you. So I do kind of like trying Stronic Resonator here. And the last artifact suggestion I had for this deck, one of the things that Austin mentioned was closing out games being an issue. I've talked about Vorpal Sword plenty on the show in the past. I would run a Vorpal Sword here, though. Like, I know that sounds like something I keep suggesting for black decks, but your commander has evasion baked into it. You've got some things that make big mana here, whether it's the Cabal Coffers or maybe Nykthos or the Cryptghast anyway. I just don't think mana is going to be a problem for this deck. You've got plenty of ramp. There's going to be enough situations where you can just, hey, it's turn 8 or turn 9. Oh, I just top decked a Vorpal Sword. Oh, I can just equip it to Rankle and kill somebody. Like, you're just going to find yourself in that position with it. So, like, it's not, an amazing CEDH level card, but, like, I think in this deck, you would find yourself being able to just take people out with a Vorpal Sword. I think it helps a ton that your commander both has haste and evasion built in. But yeah, that's one I would strongly consider here. It would solve a little bit of that how to win games problem.
Yeah. My other suggestion, and this probably has to do more with trying to keep up with the other board states in his group, a Bolus of Citadel. Life is a resource. So you might get lucky and cast, Bolus of Citadel and be able to cast all these low mana value mana rocks in a row. Or you might be able to cast, some of these big creatures that might be sitting on top of your deck and people just aren't going to see it coming.
Yeah, real solid. In this deck especially, I like that quite a bit. Well, Max, do you want to go over to do enchantments now?
Let's go down to the enchantments. There are 9 enchantments. We have an Animate Dead, a Bitter Blossom, Dance of the Dead, and I will read this one because I feel like it's been errated.
Have fun reading Dance of the Dead.
Enchant creature in a graveyard. When Dance of the Dead enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it loses enchant creature card in graveyard and gains enchant creature put onto the battlefield with Dance of the Dead. Put enchanted creature card onto the battlefield tapped under your control and attach Dance of the Dead to it. When Dance of the Dead leaves the battlefield, that creature's controller sacrifices it. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. At the beginning of the upkeep of Enchanted Creature's controller, that player may pay 1 and a black. If that player does, untap that creature. Okay then, thank you, Ice Age, for that mess of a card.
So Dance of the Dead is basically a real version of those, the Secret Lair all-text lands.
Yeah.
Those lands were very much seemingly inspired by Dance of the Dead. It's not an Animate Dead effect, essentially, as an enchantment that's worded in just the worst possible way.
and you have to pay to untap the body.
Yes.
We have a Grave Pact. Whenever a creature you control is put into a graveyard from play, each other player sacrifices a creature. Koskun Falls is the black fog. It's an enchant world. During your upkeep, tap target untapped creature you control or sacrifice Koskun Falls. No creatures can attack you unless its controller pays 2 whenever that creature attacks. So it's the black Ghostly Prison. We have Necromancy, which I'm probably going to have to look on Scryfall, because that again looks like there's about 4 miles of text on that. Necromancy is for 2 and a black. This is from Visions, everybody. You may cast Necromancy as though it had flash. If you cast it anytime a sorcery couldn't have been cast, the controller of the permanent it becomes sacrifices it at the beginning of the next cleanup step. When Necromancy enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it becomes an aura with enchant creature put onto the battlefield with Necromancy. Put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control and attach Necromancy to it. When Necromancy leaves the battlefield, it's that creature's controller sacrifices it. So another Animate Dead with way too many words.
Yes. Basically, yep.
We also have a Phyrexian Arena. Phyrexian Reclamation, 1 and a black, pay 2 life, return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And we have a Meat Hook Massacre. This is from one of the new Innistrad sets, I think Crimson Vow. Oh no, Midnight Hunt. It's the wolf, never mind. X black for a legendary enchantment. When Meat Hook Massacre enters the battlefield, each creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. And whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. And whenever a creature an opponent dies, you gain 1 life.
A lot of reanimation to work with the things that, whether it's your creatures that are being killed that are all pretty beefy and pretty useful, or the stuff you're making other people sacrifice or discard. Lots of things reanimate there totally makes sense. Phyrexian Reclamation, kind of a similar thing as well. You're returning one of your creatures to your hand, so you're being able to recycle things that you have had to discard or had to get killed. Obviously, Grave Pact has pretty good synergy here with whenever one of your things are getting sacrificed, everyone else has to follow along. And Meathook Massacre is functionally a board wipe that sticks around, being a kind of a Blood Artist effect. Like all these things, nothing I would take out. They all make total sense in this deck. The first card I thought of to add here is the one Max has, also in his notes, which is Revel in Riches.
Yep.
It has a lot of synergy. It basically, again, it's doing multiple things this deck wants. It has a lot of synergy with what you're doing, which is forcing everyone to kill their creatures or whatever. It's giving you treasure to use to, push yourself forward. And it's another win condition, which is said this deck is struggling with a little bit. So it's giving you an alt win, kind of like the Vorpal Sword does. So that would be the primary one I would suggest here. The other one I was kind of thinking about was maybe Black Market, again, because so many creatures are probably dying in this deck. But I feel like Revel in Riches is, given the choice, Revel in Riches is much better just in general, let alone for this deck. I don't think you need or want both. So I would definitely take a look at Revel in Riches, though, for sure.
Awesome.
What next?
Let's move on to the instants.
All right.
There are 11 of them. We have a Baleful Mastery. This is 3 and a black, or you can pay 1 and a black, and you exile target creature or planeswalker, but if you paid the alternate cost, an opponent draws a card. Deadly Dispute. 1 and a black, additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, you draw 2 cards and make a treasure. Deadly Rollick was the black free spell from the Commander Ikoria set. If you control your commander, you cast it for free and you exile target creature. We have a Hero's Downfall, Malakar Rebirth, another reanimation spell, or it's a land that enters tapped and can tap for black on the reverse side. Snuff Out, 3 and a black. If you control a swamp, you may pay 4 life instead of paying the mana cost, and then you destroy target non-black creature and it can't be regenerated. Soul Shatter is 2 and a black. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the highest CMC among creatures and planeswalkers they control. Sudden Spoiling, just a great way to wreck someone's day. Tragic Slip is a single black. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, or it has Morbid, and that creature gets -13/-13 until end of turn if a creature died this turn. And then we have a Vampiric Tutor, and a Withering Boon is 1 and a black. You pay 3 life. Counter target creature spell.
Okay, so a lot of targeted removal here, basically, and some utility spells.
Yep.
I like all of these. The first one I will point out is I'm a big fan of Soul Shatter. Number 1, doesn't hit your stuff, which is useful unless you have like a Grave Path Out or something. But number 2, it works around the problem that you sometimes get with edicts, where the person who has 3 1/1s or that Wood Elf that they already used to get the creature back, or to get the land, and they want it to die so they can reanimate it, or just because they don't care. You're skipping around that by forcing them to sacrifice what is probably one of their more effective things in play. So I like Soul Shatter a lot, and I'm glad to see it show up in this deck. The couple of things I'm less huge about, I feel like, I guess this deck has a good amount of utility lands, so maybe Defile isn't as great as it is elsewhere, but Defile gives a creature -1/-1 for each swamp you control. So in like some mono black decks with a ton of swamps, Defile is almost always going to be a better Tragic Slip, because it just always turned on. You don't have to worry about something dying that turn. It's probably slightly less better in this particular deck because there's not necessarily that many swamps, but I still think you will find out that Defile is easier to use, particularly in a higher power meta where you're like not, for the most part, dealing with 8/8 beaters or something. It's smaller creatures that fill a role. I just feel like I would rather run Defile, I think, than Tragic Slip for the same mana cost.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't think Withering Boon is very good. Basically, you're killing a creature on the stack versus when it hits the field. And I guess that's useful for stopping a Crater Hoof or a creature with an ETB or something. But aside from that, you're just paying extra life to kill something. And then the spell doesn't do any, once it's resolved, doesn't do you any good. So like, if there's problems in play, you can't use Withering Boon to solve them. You want to use them to solve them when they're on the stack. I think I just try to run a removal spell there.
Go for the Throat. Perfect example to swap in there.
Or the Defile if you want to keep Tragic Slip around. However, the thing I will note is it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, like, if you want to cite the rule of cool and say that you'd rather run Withering Boon, even though it isn't as good, so you can, like, have a black counterspell, I will never tell you not to do that. I totally get why you would do that. If you want a black counterspell, though, I think Imp's Mischief is generally going to be much better than Withering Boon is.
I think this might just be a meta call, because I was about to say the same thing, but like Imp's Mischief, you can only change the target of a spell with a single target.
Right, yep.
And, I mean, creatures don't target it unless they're, like, mutating or something, I guess. So I think it's probably meta-dependent.
Yeah, for sure, it could be. Yeah, because Withering Boon's not going to stop that Crater Hoop, and it's not going to stop if someone, brings in Thassa's Oracle at the right time.
Right.
Whereas Withering Boon will stop that. Like you can, if it's a meta call or you're just running it because it's a cool old thing in black that black never does, I totally get that. Any other suggestions from you for this one, Max?
No, I think this is a great instant package. Like I looked at this for a long time between yesterday and this morning. I'm like, I still can't think of anything to swap in and out. So this is something I would probably run if this was my deck.
Okay, cool. All right, well, let's go over and take a look at the sorceries then. We have Agadeem's Awakening. That was the mythic from the Zendikar Resurgence cycle. Return from your graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that all have different converted mana costs of X or less. Or you can just play it as a land that taps for black mana, and if you spend 3 life, it doesn't come into play tapped. Damnation, Black's Wrath of God. You have a Dark Deal. Each player discards all the cards in their hand and draws that many cards -1. So it's a way to put creatures in the graveyard to reanimate, and it works off Gath's Grimoire and works with this stuff this deck is doing in general. Demonic Tutor. Exsanguinate, which you talked about maybe wanting to pull out. Feed the Swarm, destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls, and you lose life equal to the permanent's mana value. Just having the ability to destroy enchantments in black is a pretty big deal. Grim Tutor, just another way to tutor up things you need. Night's Whisper and Read the Bones, 2 great draw spells along with Sign in Blood. Ritual of the Machine, a cool card from Alliances. Sacrifice a creature to gain control of target non-black, non-artifact creature.
What?
Yeah, that's odd.
Why does this have only like 2 lines of text and the other gold cards had 400? Like,
certainly
come on.
They could have found a much worse way to word that back in the Alliance days. And last but not least, to Victimize, 2 in a black. Choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature, and if you do, return the chosen card to the battlefield tapped. So sacrifice, for example, the fairy you made with your Bitter Blossom, or there's a couple other ways we'll probably talk about things that make tokens as well. Sacrifice those things to bring back your big scary things. Any sorceries that you particularly liked or disliked here, Max?
I get why Dark Deal is here.
Yeah.
I just don't like it.
Sure.
I think this is one of those weird things. Since Rankle is very symmetrical, in its effect, making all your opponents discard a card, you're still discarding. So this isn't a scenario where you're sitting there with 7 cards and they're sitting there with 2.
Right.
So you're going to draw 6 and they draw 1. It's everybody's at 2 or 3 cards. So now you're spending 3 mana to draw, 2 or 3 cards, maybe 4 cards, depending on hand size. I think this is definitely a card you play when you're ready to win the game. I think that's why it's in here.
And there's definitely reanimation here. So like them putting stuff in their graveyard isn't without value. Well, there's not that much reanimation, right? It's not a deck that's running, 14 reanimation pieces or something where every time someone pitches something, you're going to be able to have a chance to get it back. There's some stuff here, but it's not maybe that necessarily amazing. And this also isn't a Nekusar deck where you're getting a ton of added value from that forced discard. I mean, you are a little bit. There's Gath's Grimoire, I guess. There's a few things like that. I think we'll talk about a couple creatures that are in the deck that do it as well. But again, it's different when like you have Nekusar in the command zone and that this card's also going to deal 5 damage to everybody. This isn't that. I don't think it's bad or anything, but like if the cool new card that's going to come out, a new competitor that you're going to want to add to this deck, Dark Deal is definitely one of the ones I would be probably willing to swap out for whatever the new hotness was. For
sure. There is a couple cards I think that could be added that helps with the reanimation. The first being Incarnation Technique. I talked about this a few weeks ago. This is a card in my Ubosh deck. It's 4 in a black, and it has the keyword demonstrate. So when you demonstrate a spell, when you cast it, you may copy it, but if you do, an opponent also gets a copy of the spell. But what Incarnation Technique does is mill 5 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And what's great is it's not a creature you just milled. It's something that could be already there. And if you demonstrate this, you get that twice. So you're milling 10, bringing back 2 things, whether that's a card you dumped because of Dark Deal, or just something you've already had killed off the battlefield or sacrificed for another card. You're just going to get 2 things back. I really like this card. It's a card I always love to cast in my Ubosh deck, and I think a lot more reanimation decks need to be playing this.
Yeah, I think it's really solid too, and again, I think this deck would be a good fit for it.
I also think, we have a board wipe in this deck. In this section with Damnation, you mentioned Meat Hook Massacre kind of being a pseudo board wipe as well. So I'm just going to add to the pseudo board wipe column. And Toxic Deluge. A lot of the big beaters in this deck have 5 or 6 power. Cast it for 4. Like, just kill off all the little things your opponents control, and then, hit them for a handful of damage, and then next turn you're set up with a bunch of big bad beaters ready to take out everybody.
Yeah, particularly because Deluge is pretty cheap right now.
Yes.
And I'm surprised it hasn't started to creep up, because a lot of things have from the last reprinting. Maybe because Black's gotten a few more board wipes lately, and it's no longer the only other game in town aside from Damnation. I guess Meathook Massacre is probably competing with it a little bit. But yeah, I think this is a good deck for Deluge. There's a lot of bigger things that will kind of work around it. Yeah.
Anything from you, Dana?
No, that's really it. I think Ritual of the Machine is super cool. Unfortunately, you can't hit black creatures or whatever, but like they used to like to use that clause and stuff, and even if it doesn't necessarily make any sense, I like to see that here as well. It's just a fun old card, and glad to see that. But no, I'm ready to move on to look at the Planeswalkers here quick. We have Liliana Death's Majesty, 3 black. She creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token for her +1, and you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. Her -3 is return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and that creature is a zombie in addition to its types. And a -7, destroy all non-zombie creatures. This is probably primarily just a way to make tokens that are going to enable you to sacrifice stuff to Rankle.
And the reanimation with the
reanimation
-3
isn't a non-zero factor as well, yeah. Tavish Zod, Doom of Fools, 4 and a black for a 4 loyalty planeswalker. His +2 is create 2 0/1 black Thrall creature tokens. His +1 is you may sacrifice another creature or planeswalker, and if you do, draw 2 cards, then draw another card if the sacrifice permanent was a commander. And -10, gain control of all commanders, and put all commanders from the command zone onto the battlefield under your control. So again, primarily is probably going to be a way to make things that you can sacrifice to Rankle without really caring if you lose them in terms of the thralls here.
Yep.
I think they both make sense here. I think actually I liked Tavish Zot more than you do, Max. I think the being able to make 2 bodies, even if you only get 1 or 2 uses out of it, that's probably going to be really helpful with Rankle. Versus Liliana, you're only making 1 zombie at a time. I guess you get to put stuff in your own graveyard too, but I like Tavish Zot more than Liliana, and if I was going to pull, I don't think she's bad or anything, but I don't think I think she's the lesser of the 2 planeswalkers. What do you think?
I am the reverse.
Okay.
I think this is another example of where I think if you were to pick one of these abilities Rankle has to focus on, both make a lot of sense. I totally understand what you said about Tavish Zot making bodies to have sacrifice fodder for either Rankle or some of the other spells in the deck. Why I like Liliana better, though, is her other ability, at least her second ability, I think does more for what the deck is trying to do than Tavish Zot does. My recommendation would be add Liliana of the Dark Realms.
Okay.
So that's 2 and 2 black for a 3 loyalty planeswalker. Her +1 says search your library for a swamp card, reveal it, and put it into your hand and shuffle. Cool. Her -3 is target creature gets +X or -X until end of turn, where X is the number of swamps you control, and then her emblem at -6 is swamps you control tapped for quadruple black. That -3 can really help get damage through, or help get something out of the way that probably might have blocked you if you couldn't give it -8, because if you drop this on turn 5 or 6, I'm assuming you have 6 swamps, or so you're already giving something +6 or something -6. That's huge that early in the game.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a planeswalker that's going to be useful in a lot of situations, regardless of what you're doing, and would be very beneficial in this particular deck for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I will note this though, like if I'm trying to find room for something in this deck, I feel like I'm probably, it's pretty easy to pull either one of those planeswalkers and feel like it doesn't change the face of the deck too much. They're useful, but I'm not sure either one of them are like that integral to the deck functioning.
That I will agree with.
Okay. Last but not least, the creatures. Why don't you tell us what creatures we have in this deck, Max?
There are 20 creatures. Arcana Cruelty. This was from Modern Horizons 2, 6 and 2 black. It flies, it's a 6/6, and when ETBs are attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. There's a Bloodghast. Burning Rune Demon is 4 and 2 black. Flying. When Burning Rune Demon enters the battlefield, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them. Put the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Shuffle your library. Coffin Queen, 2 and a black. You may choose not to untap Coffin Queen during your untap phase. And for 2 and a black and tap, put target creature card from any graveyard into play under your control. Remove the creature card from the game if Coffin Queen becomes untapped or if you lose control of Coffin Queen. Cryptghast, mana doubler. Dothoi Voidwalker is double black. This is also from Modern Horizons 2. It has Shadow, and if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it in instead with a void counter on it, and then you can tap and sacrifice the Voidwalker and choose a exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it, and you may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. We have a Dream Devourer, 1 and a black. Each non-land card in your hand without Foretell has Foretell, and its Foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2. And then whenever you Foretell a card, Dream Devourer gets +2/+0. We have Erebos, God of the Dead. Nice little greed on an indestructible body, I should say. Gissa, Glorious Resurrector, 2 and 2 black for a 4/4 legendary creature. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exiled instead. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, put all creature cards exiled with Gissa onto the battlefield under your control, and they gain Decayed, which I believe means they can't block. Correct?
Yes. And if you attack with them, you sacrifice them at the beginning of the
end of combat, right?
Yep.
Grave Titan, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, Kyrix, Son of Yawgmoth. This is 4 and triple Phyrexian black mana. For a 2/2, it has lifelink, and then for each black in a cost, you may pay 2 life rather than pay the mana. And then whenever you cast a black spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kyrix, Son of Yawgmoth. Kukushko, the Evening Star, Lord of the Void, 4 triple black for a flying 7/7. And when it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 7 cards of that player's library. Put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield under your control. Murderous Rider is the adventure card that is essentially Hero's Downfall plus a 2/3 flyer. And it goes to the bottom of your library when it dies. Ophiomancer makes that Death Touch snake every upkeep if you don't control a snake. Phyrexian Obliterator, quadruple black for a 5/5 with trample. And if whenever a source deals damage to it, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. So, nice little blocker right there. Shieldred, the Whispering One. The beginning of each player's upkeep, they sacrifice a creature. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, you bring something back from a graveyard to the battlefield. And it has Swamp Walk. I'm sorry, it's the Phyrexian printed in the deck list, so I'm trying to do this from memory. Tegrid, God of Fright, 3 black for a 4/5 with Menace. Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, and then it also is an artifact on the backside, which I don't think is probably the use of this card.
Yes.
And then finally, Villas, Broker of Blood, 5 triple black for an 8/8 with flying. You can pay black and 2 life and target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. And whenever you lose life, draw that many cards. 20 creatures, Dana, that's a lot.
A lot with a lot of text on all of them.
Yeah, this is why I don't read books, everybody. I just read deck lists every week.
Not a lot of Llanowar elf type creatures in this deck for sure. You have things that do big, beefy, effective things, and you have stuff like Blood Gas that you're going to want to that's there so it can be sacrificed and recurred, basically. Yep. So the first thing I want to talk about is a note Max had here for the creatures that I actually really, really like that didn't occur to me till I read it here in your notes, Max, which would be one of the things Austin mentioned was maybe pulling some tutors out. I liked your idea of running creature tutors in those slots instead. Yes, they're less efficient, but if you are wanting to pull tutors just to make the deck not run the same way necessarily, I feel like turning that Demonic Tutor into a Runescarred Demon or turning the Vamp Tutor into a Sidisi Undead Vizier or something is going to, number one, eliminate some of that because they're not nearly as efficient. So you're not going to be able to, the deck isn't going to feel like it plays the same way as much. You need to be more purposeful about what you choose to go get. But then number two, it's going to give you a giant beater body that's going to make it maybe a little bit easier to, number one, prevent dying, and number two, make it easier for you to kill people to a degree.
Yep.
So I actually quite like that suggestion, to turn your regular tutors into creatures that have tutor abilities on them as well. And you also get a little bit of extra utility too, because you have, and reanimation. So maybe you'll find yourself in a situation where also you're like, oh, I've got this Runescarred Demon out, and I might as well use my Rankle ability to force the sacrifice on everyone else's stuff, and I'll sacrifice the Runescarred Demon and then reanimate it or whatever. So there's some cross play there as well that probably feels like a little bit of fun. So I just, in a general sense, I like that suggestion a lot.
Thank you. That was my shower thought of the day. I was getting ready for the day. I'm like, oh, this is how I can help the tutor and creature section at the same time. Yeah,
no, I like that one quite a bit. Any other real creatures that you thought were interesting or would be really useful in this deck?
A creature that I have had my butt kicked by plenty of times in the past in a deck like this would be Demon of Dark Schemes. This was from Aether Revolt. When it enters the battlefield, all other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. Whenever another creature dies, you get an energy, and you can pay 2 and a black and 4 energy to reanimate a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control tapped. So it's not just reanimating your stuff, you can reanimate anything. And it's 3 and triple black for a 5/5 flyer. So not only is it doing some work, it can probably do some damage as well.
One creature suggestion I had here was Bone Miser. 4 and black for a 4/4. Whenever you discard a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature. So when you hit that discard point, with Rankle, the creature that you're pitching that you're going to reanimate, you're also making a zombie that you can use next time around to sacrifice a creature to Rankle. And those are sequenced correctly on Rankle. So if you choose all 3 of them, each player discards a card, you can get your discard off, create your zombie, and then when it comes time to sacrifice a creature, sacrifice that zombie to the same portion of the trigger. So I do think Bone Miser is really solid here. And I guess we probably should have mentioned Waste Not as well over in the enchantment section to kind of go along with Rankle's discard thing. But I guess maybe there's not a lot of other synergy besides Rankle, so I'm not sure if that's worth the slot. But I do think Bone Miser is, because it works with a bunch of the things you're doing in a way. So I definitely would like to see that, I think, in this deck. I think it would do a lot of good here.
Yeah, I was originally going to put those in my notes as well, but I think for me, like I've kind of been saying, it fell into the what does this deck really want to do?
Sure, yes,
and do you want to push to one ability or the other?
Yeah. Other than that, I mean, like I know he talked about wanting to pull Grey Merchant because it's just a generically useful card. I don't think you should necessarily feel bad about playing Grey Merchant in a deck either. Games do have to end. But this creature suite's just like everything's a beating.
Right. And I mean, we have new Capenna coming up, so you'll probably get a couple mono black demons coming our way. Every deck is going to have some big 5/5 black creature that has a cool ability. So, like, this is one of these decks where you could eventually swap out, Grey Merchant for something cool, and then if it doesn't pan out, you put Grey Merchant back.
Right, yeah.
And I do agree. You shouldn't feel bad about playing Grey Merchant of Asphodel. You have to just be concerned about how you play it. Like, if you're tutoring for it, yeah, I would feel bad if I always tutor for Grey Merchant when I have, 15 devotion on field or something. But
right.
If you naturally draw into it, or if someone traumatizes you and you end up reanimating it, well, that's not on them. That's not on you. That's on them.
Exactly.
So I think it's fine.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
And I guess that is kind of the downfall of mono black, though, is like all the traditional win cons that we think of are all somewhat boring.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it feels a little bit like the problem with my Glissa deck as well, where right. I'm in the same boat where I feel like I'm doing a little bit too much just general value, and it makes it tough sometimes to compete with a more explosive deck. So I understand the pain here for sure. All right, Max, any final thoughts here before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really cool deck. I'll beat the dead horse one more time. I think if you were to look at this deck and maybe focus on which of Rankle's abilities you use the most, maybe it's one of those things where you just start tracking it. Like, in the next 30 games, how many times did I make everybody discard a card? How many did I lose a life and draw a card? How many times did I make them sacrifice a creature? If you can kind of see that and say like, oh geez, I actually do use the discard one the most, maybe tune this a little to be more discard focused. Now, I'm not saying go full Tiny Bones, but you could put a Tiny Bones in here.
Yeah, because like if you make that choice, there's some things like I didn't mention Containment Construct under the artifacts because it really only works with discard when you discard a card. That was a card from Neon Dynasty. It's 2 mana for a 2/1 creature. I guess under creatures, or I would have mentioned it. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard, and if you do, you may play that card this turn. So like if you are going heavy to the discard, there's a lot of opportunities to use that, but I guess even as it is right now, with Rankle, that works pretty decent. You just pitch the land that you're going to play for your land this turn anyway, and then just play it. In the second main phase, you're really out nothing. It kind of neuters the forced discard portion of Rankle. But as it is right now, I'm not sure if you want to, like, it's worth leaning too heavily into that. But if you lean more heavily into the discard portion, something like Containment Construct gets that much better.
Exactly. So I think it is just one of those things where I personally would probably pick a path. And then that's what I would do personally. If you just like being kind of an agent of chaos and being like, well, this turn I'm going to make everybody lose a life and draw a card, and next turn you make them sacrifice. That's cool if that's how you want to play the deck, but it sounds like this is probably the deck you play towards the higher end of the power range in your group. So maybe if you can focus what you're trying to do with it, you might pull out a couple more wins.
All right. I think that's going to wrap up Commander Central episode 312. Thank you very much to listener Austin Yorko for sharing his Rankle Master of Pranks deck, and thanks to everyone out there for listening. I am Dana. You can find me on the Twitter words at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR Central _Max, and you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia. You can find them on the Twitterbirds at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with a new show. Until then, I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.